This was the geopolitical reality of Bengal in the early 1770s. The British East India Company possessed the military power, but the surviving Mughal Diwani, the traditional revenue and tax system, still governed the extraction of wealth. The British Parliament recognized it needed to regulate the company's sprawling corporate administration, yet Parliament actively refused to formally claim sovereignty over the territory or its native inhabitants. The constitutional architecture of colonial India functioned like the source code for a state operating system. Running a government without defining the ultimate sovereign leaves a void at the very top of the legal hierarchy. There is no root user to resolve systemic conflicts. While organic states developed these hierarchies over centuries, Parliament attempted to legislate one blindly from thousands of miles away in London. Compiling an administrative state without a defined sovereign is like building without a root directory. It creates a system designed to fail under pressure. Parliament's legislative solution was the Regulating Act of 1773. As this document details, the act created two primary branches of power in Bengal: a governor-general with a council and a Supreme Court of Judicature. The mandate of the newly created executive branch, the governor-general and council, was to manage and extract territorial revenue. The mandate of the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, was to administer English common law and check corporate corruption among company servants. Parliament bolted these two radically different systems together, aiming them at a single node, the local population, but drew no jurisdictional boundary. Because the act deliberately avoided defining ultimate authority over the natives, it created a massive glitch in the hierarchy. The ensuing 6 years of administrative chaos were the systematic output of this constitutional error, regardless of the personal animosities between the politicians involved. Applying English common law writs to a feudal revenue system without explicitly defined jurisdiction results in a state that consumes itself. The specific bug in the 1773 Act is visible right here in the text. It grants the Supreme Court legal power over anyone employed or directly or indirectly in the service of the company. This wording forced a critical logic gate question. Is a native samandar, a traditional local tax and revenue farmer, legally an employee of the East India Company? From the perspective of the Executive Council, zamindars were subjects of the Mughal emperor, operating within a traditional revenue structure entirely outside English law. The Supreme Court read the statute differently. If zamindars collect revenue that ultimately enters the company's treasury, they are indirectly in the service of the company and therefore subject to English common law. This interpretation was far-reaching. If zamindars were company servants, the Supreme Court instantly gained jurisdiction over the entire economy and rural administration of Bengal. The executive's operational reality was that revenue collection in 18th century Bengal required localized, summary, and inherently coercive enforcement to function. Peons were routinely stationed at a defaulter's home until a debt was paid. But under English common law, that exact type of coercive financial enforcement without a trial is classified as oppression and illegal imprisonment. This was a complete contradiction in the operational logic of the state, pitting the requirement of revenue directly against the requirement of legal rights. The first major system failure hit in 1777 with the Patna cause, a logic error that dismantled the province's existing judicial machinery. At the time, local revenue councils regularly delegated fact-finding in complex native disputes to traditional Muslim law officers, known as the qazi and muftis. The specific trigger for the Patna cause was a bitter inheritance dispute involving the widow of a military adventurer and his nephew. The provincial council issued a standard order to the qazi and muftis to secure the property and report the facts of the inheritance back to the council. The Supreme Court aggressively intervened, ordering the arrest and prosecution of the native law officers for carrying out the council's orders. The court used the English legal doctrine delegatus non potest delegare, a delegate cannot delegate, striking down the process. Because the provincial council was a delegated authority, it had no right to delegate hearings to native officers. The lower machinery crumbled. The human cost of applying this strict English legal theory was devastating. The suspected native officers were ruined, heavily fined, and dragged to prison in Calcutta. The aged qazi died during the journey. This ruling terrified native administrators across Bengal. any action they took for the council could now result in total personal ruin in the Supreme Court. The Patna cause proved the Supreme Court could functionally outlaw the province's existing administrative and investigative machinery overnight, purely on theoretical grounds. 2 years later, in 1779, the legal paradox became a physical conflict. The Kashijura cause was the ultimate hardware crash. The inciting incident was simple. A zemindar, the Raja of Kashijura, was sued in the Supreme Court by a creditor, and the court attempted to assume jurisdiction over him. The Executive Council, desperate to prevent a total economic collapse, issued a formal notification instructing landholders they were not subject to the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. The court escalated to extreme, unprecedented measures. They dispatched a sheriff's force composed of dozens of armed sailors to forcefully seize the zemindar. The executive delivered its ultimate counter-escalation. The governor-general explicitly ordered regular military troops to march on the sheriff's posse and disarm them. In a shocking display of systemic failure, the two branches of the British colonial government literally collided in the field. The legal fallout was severe. Furious at the military intervention, the Supreme Court imprisoned the company's own attorney for contempt, who eventually died in prison. By refusing to draw boundaries, the Regulating Act successfully engineered a scenario where the executive government was forced into a state of open, armed warfare with its own highest court just to survive. How do legal historians adjudicate a crisis where both branches claim they were merely following the law? Historian James Mill argued that Parliament acted blindfold, creating two rival, independent powers without drawing a boundary to mark the limits of either. Sir J.F. Stephen offered a counter-perspective. The Supreme Court was legally justified and had an unquestionable right to stop the abuses of the revenue collectors. Both interpretations are technically sound, but the Supreme Court's application of English common law was structurally incompatible with the reality of colonial administration. The crisis forced the British Parliament to step in and compile a permanent patch to the Constitution via the Act of 1781. The technical fix was precise. The Act explicitly exempted zamindars, revenue farmers, and the collection of revenue from the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. It also finally provided legal recognition to the native Diwani courts, protecting their officers from being sued in the Supreme Court for their judicial actions. The 1781 patch succeeded by finally drawing the hard, explicitly defined jurisdictional lines that the 1773 Act had arrogantly omitted. Returning to the system's architecture, the unassigned zone was finally replaced by a rigid boundary wall. The 1773 to 1780 Bengal crisis provides a stark lesson for modern legal scholars and institutional designers. You cannot simply export a highly evolved judicial checking mechanism to a foreign territory without first establishing a unified underlying theory of sovereignty. Powerful legal tools like habeas corpus and common law writs are only instruments of justice when they operate within clearly defined borders. When jurisdiction is left ambiguous by the legislature, the law ceases to prevent oppression. It merely paralyzes the state and forces the government to wage war upon itself.